The night my husband walked out, he left a folder of divorce papers on the kitchen table and whispered, "I can't waste my life waiting for a miracle." I thought losing him was the worst thing that could happen. Until a stranger's heartbreaking secret changed my future forever. My name is Emily Carter, and for 9 years I believed I was the reason my marriage was falling apart. When Daniel and I got married, we were young, hopeful, and completely certain that life would work out exactly the way we planned. We bought a little white house on the edge of town with an extra bedroom that we called the nursery before there was ever a baby to put inside it. We painted the walls a soft yellow. We argued over whether we wanted a boy or a girl. First, Daniel wanted a son to teach baseball. I wanted a daughter who would steal my sweaters and tell me about her day after school. Back then, those dreams felt so close that we could almost touch them. The first year passed, and we weren't worried. The second year, our families started asking questions. By the third year, every holiday dinner had become an interrogation. So, any good news yet? You two aren't getting any younger. My cousin tried this special clinic, and now she has 3 children. People think those comments are harmless. They smile when they say them. They think they're showing interest. What they don't see is the drive home afterward, when the car is completely silent because neither of you knows what to say anymore. At first, Daniel would squeeze my hand and tell me everything would be okay. "We're a team," he'd whisper. No matter what happens, I believed him. Then came the doctor. Appointments, blood tests, scans, hormone, treatments, specialists in different cities. Every month became the same painful cycle. Hope, waiting, disappointment, tears. Then, somehow finding the strength to do it all over again. Lost count of how many times I sat in a hospital waiting room pretending not to cry, while pregnant women walked past, holding ultrasound pictures. The worst day came. When one of the fertility specialists looked at my file, adjusted his glasses, and quietly said, "The chances are low, Emily. Not impossible, but much lower than we'd like. Low, not zero, but somehow." That one word changed everything. Daniel stopped talking about the future. The yellow nursery became a storage room filled with old boxes and forgotten furniture. The little baby shoes my mother had knitted for us stayed tucked away in a drawer where I couldn't bear to look at them. Still, I never gave up. I changed my diet. I took every medication they recommended. I read books, joined support groups, and spent nights searching the internet for stories about women who had finally become mothers after years of heartbreak. I kept hoping that one day our miracle would come. I didn't realize that while I was fighting to save our dream, Daniel had already stopped believing in it. The first sign was so small I almost missed it. He started working late. Then he stopped eating dinner at home. Weekends that we used to spend together suddenly belonged to business, trips, and important meetings. When I asked if something was wrong, he'd force a smile and tell me I was imagining things. But you can't spend 9 years with someone without learning when they're lying. One rainy Thursday evening, I came home from another appointment with a fertility specialist carrying a folder full of tests, results I barely understood. The house was quiet. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table. In front of him was a stack of papers. He didn't even look at me when I walked in. "How did the appointment go?" he asked. I tried to smile. "The doctor wants to try one last treatment. He says there are new options we haven't explored." Daniel closed his eyes. Then he pushed the papers across the table. At the top of the first page were 2 words that made my hands go numb: petition for divorce. I laughed, not because it was funny, because my mind refused to believe what I was seeing. "Is this some kind of joke?" He looked at me then, but there was no anger in his face. No sadness either, just exhaustion. "I can't do this anymore, Emily." I felt the room spinning around me. Can't do what? This life. The hospitals. The waiting. The disappointment. I wanted a family, and after 9 years... He stopped and stared at the floor. "I don't think it's ever going to happen." The words hit harder than I expected. So you're leaving me because I couldn't have a baby? His silence was answer enough. I begged him to reconsider. I reminded him of our wedding vows. I told him we could adopt. I told him we could travel, start over somewhere new, build a different kind of future. He shook his head. I don't want a different future. I want the one we planned. Then he picked up his suitcase from beside the door. Before he left, he said something I don't think I'll ever forget. I hope one day you understand why I had to do this. The front door closed behind him, and just like that, the life I'd spent nearly a decade building disappeared. For weeks, I barely left the house. Friends called, but I ignored them. My mother drove over with groceries and found me sitting on the nursery floor surrounded by unopened boxes. I couldn't stop thinking that maybe Daniel was right. Maybe I had wasted the best years of his life. Maybe loving me had cost him the family he always wanted. 3 months later, I sold the house. I couldn't walk past that empty yellow room anymore. Moved into a small rental cottage on the edge of a quiet neighborhood where nobody knew me and nobody asked questions. The woman who handed me the keys mentioned that the elderly widower living next door mostly kept to himself. Poor man, she sighed. Lost his wife and little girl in an accident years ago. Hardly speaks to anyone now. I nodded politely, not expecting our paths to ever cross. The last thing I wanted was another reminder of loss. But on my very first evening there, I was carrying a heavy box from my car when it slipped from my hands and crashed onto the driveway. Books scattered everywhere. Before I could bend down, someone else was already helping me gather them. He was tall, maybe in his early 40s, dressed in old work clothes with tired eyes that looked like they hadn't smiled in years. He picked up a framed photograph that had fallen from the box. It was my wedding picture. His eyes moved from the photograph to the empty space where my wedding ring used to. He handed it back without asking a single question. Then, in a quiet voice, he simply said, "Some things break long before people admit they're broken." I stared at him, surprised by the sadness behind those words. He gave a small, apologetic nod. "My name's Michael. I live next door." I introduced myself, and for a moment we just stood there in silence. Two strangers carrying different kinds of grief. Then he pointed to one of the boxes. "You've got one marked kitchen. If you don't mind, I can help you carry it inside." I almost said no. After everything that had happened, trusting anyone felt impossible. But there was something about the loneliness in his eyes that felt strangely familiar. So I stepped aside and let him help. I had no way of knowing that the quiet man carrying my boxes into that little cottage would one day become the biggest surprise of my life, or that the truth about my failed marriage was far darker than I had ever imagined. The last thing I wanted was to let another person into my life. After Daniel left, I had built invisible walls around myself. They were easier than answering questions. Easier than hearing people say, "Everything happens for a reason," as if 9 years of heartbreak and a marriage ending could be explained with a greeting card quote. So when Michael carried the last box into my little rental cottage, I thanked him politely and expected that would be the end of it. Instead, he pointed toward the old coffee maker sitting on my counter. "That thing doesn't work," he said. I frowned. "How do you know?" A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Because it belonged to the previous tenant. She left it behind after it broke." I looked at the dusty machine, then back at him. "You could have let me spend an hour trying to figure that out." "I could have." His smile disappeared almost as quickly as it had come. But some mistakes don't need to be repeated. There was something about the way he said it that made me think he wasn't talking about coffee makers. The weeks passed quietly. I found a part-time bookkeeping job at a local hardware company. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and kept my mind occupied. Every morning, I'd see Michael outside before sunrise, working in his garden or repairing something around his old brick house. He always waved, always offered a simple good morning, but never tried to force a conversation. I appreciated that. He seemed to understand what it felt like to carry around a grief too. Heavy to explain. One Saturday afternoon, a storm rolled through town. The wind was so strong that it knocked over the old wooden fence separating our properties. I was outside, trying to drag a broken section back into place when Michael appeared with a toolbox in one hand and a thermos in the other. "You're doing that wrong," he said. I crossed my arms, and here I thought I was an expert in emergency fence repair. For the first time, I heard him laugh. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of laugh someone makes after forgetting they still know how. Together, we spent the next 2 hours fixing the fence while the rain came down around us. When we finally finished, soaked from head to toe, he poured 2 cups of coffee from the thermos. We sat on the porch steps in silence. Then I noticed a small silver chain around his neck. Hanging from it was a tiny charm shaped like a butterfly. "That's beautiful," I said quietly. His fingers instinctively closed around it. It belonged to my daughter. I instantly regretted asking. "I'm sorry." "You don't have to. Her name was Lily," he interrupted gently. She was 6 years old. The rain seemed to get louder. My wife, Anna, was driving her home from school. A truck ran a red light. He didn't cry while he said it. Somehow that made it even harder to hear. I was supposed to pick them up that day. I was running late at work, so Anna said she'd do it instead. His eyes stayed fixed on the rain. I spent years wondering if they would still be alive if I'd left work 10 minutes earlier. I didn't know what to say, so I reached over and placed my hand over his. He looked surprised. Then he whispered something that stayed with me long after that day. "People think losing someone happens all at once. It doesn't. You lose them every morning you wake up and remember they're gone." For the first time since my divorce, I felt understood. By the time autumn arrived, Michael and I had become friends, real friends. We had dinner together once or twice a week. Sometimes I cooked. Sometimes he did. He was terrible at making pasta. I was somehow even worse at grilling. One evening, while we were eating takeout on my porch, he asked the question I had spent months trying to avoid. "Do you ever miss him?" I stared down at my plate. "I miss who I thought he was." Michael nodded. "That's different." I looked at him. "Isn't it the same thing?" "No." He shook his head slowly. "Missing someone who loved you is one thing. Missing the version of them you created in your mind. That's a different kind of grief," I wanted to argue. Instead, I realized he was right. The man I missed was the 28-year-old Daniel who promised we'd face everything together. The man who left me with divorce papers wasn't that person anymore. Maybe he hadn't been for a long time. A few days before Christmas, I ran into an old friend from my previous neighborhood. She looked uncomfortable the moment she saw me. "Emily," she said quietly. "I didn't know if you knew." "Knew what?" She hesitated. Then she glanced around to make sure nobody else was listening. "Daniel got remarried." I felt the air leave my lungs. "What?" She swallowed hard. "It was a small ceremony. About 2 months ago." I forced myself to smile. "Well, I hope he's happy," but she wasn't finished. "Emily, there's something else." I already knew I didn't want to hear it. "The woman he married? She's pregnant." For a second, everything around me went completely silent. Couldn't hear the traffic. I couldn't hear people talking. I could only hear one thought repeating in my mind. He left me because he wanted children. I managed to thank her for telling me before I walked away. I don't even remember driving home. When I got back to the cottage, I locked the door and broke down crying on the kitchen floor. Every fear I'd carried for 9 years came crashing back. Maybe the doctors had been wrong. Maybe the problem had never been him. Maybe I really had stolen the future he wanted. There was a knock at the door. I ignored it. Another knock, then Michael's voice. "Emily, your lights are on. Are you okay?" I opened the door just enough for him to see my face. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer empty comfort. He simply stepped inside, sat down beside me on the floor, and waited. After several minutes, I finally whispered, "He's having a baby." Michael looked at me. My ex-husband. He remarried, and now she's pregnant. I expected pity. Instead, I saw anger. Not toward me, toward the man who had made me believe I wasn't enough. He was a fool, Michael said quietly. I shook my head. No. He was honest. I couldn't give him what he wanted. Michael looked directly into my eyes. You were never supposed to earn someone's love by suffering for it. I cried harder after he said that, because deep down, I knew I'd spent years trying to deserve a love that should have been given freely. Winter turned into spring. Slowly, without either of us planning it, the friendship between Michael and me became something more. It wasn't dramatic. There was no movie-style confession. It happened in little moments. The extra cup of coffee he started making every morning, the way he remembered how I took my tea, the afternoons spent planting flowers in the garden his daughter once loved. The first time I caught him, smiling without sadness hiding behind it. One evening, almost a year after my divorce, we were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. "I have to ask you something," he said. I smiled, nervously. "That sounds serious." "It is." He took a deep breath. "Do you think two broken people can help each other heal? Or do they just end up breaking each other more?" I looked at him for a long moment. Then I answered, "Honestly, I think broken people understand the value of kindness better than anyone else." He reached for my hand, very carefully, as if he was afraid. I'd pull away. I didn't. A few weeks later, we had our first real date, nothing fancy. A quiet little diner outside town and a walk by the river afterward. When he dropped me home, he didn't try to kiss me. He simply said, "Thank you for giving me a reason to leave the house again." I laughed. Then, before I could overthink it, I leaned forward and kissed his cheek. The smile on his face stayed with me all night. 6 months later, Michael asked me to marry him. There was no expensive ring, no crowd, no grand speech. He was helping me replant the old rose bushes in my front yard. When he suddenly got down on one knee, I stared at him. "What are you doing?" He looked terrified, possibly making a fool of myself. Despite everything I'd been through, I laughed. He pulled a tiny velvet box from his pocket. Inside was a simple ring that had belonged to his grandmother. "I know we both know what it feels like to lose a family," he said, his voice shaking. "But maybe we could build a new one together." I couldn't even speak. I just nodded through the tears, and for the first time in more than a decade, I believed happiness might actually be possible, but life wasn't finished testing us. 3 months after our wedding, I woke up feeling sick. At first, I blamed food poisoning. Then the dizziness started. Michael insisted, "I see a doctor." I almost laughed. I've spent half my life in doctors' offices. "Then one more visit won't hurt," he said. The next afternoon, I sat in an examination room waiting for the results. The young doctor walked in holding a file. He looked at it, then at me, then back at the file. "Mrs. Carter, I think we should run the test again." My stomach dropped. "Why?" He smiled. "Because according to these results, you're pregnant." I stared at him. "No, that's not possible." He looked down at the chart again. "Oh, it's possible." I felt tears filling my eyes. After everything, after 9 years, after all the heartbreak, could this really be happening? The doctor turned the ultrasound screen toward me. Then his smile grew even wider. "I'm afraid I have one more surprise for you." I wiped my eyes. "What is it?" He pointed to the screen. "There isn't just one heartbeat." I looked closer. Then I saw them. 2 tiny flickering lights. The doctor laughed softly. "Congratulations. Mrs. Carter, you're having twins." I was still trying to process those words when the nurse rushed back into the room carrying another envelope. "Doctor," she said quietly, "the lab called." They found something unusual in her old medical records. The doctor opened the file, and the smile slowly disappeared from his face. He looked at me with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Mrs. Carter, I need to ask you something." My heart started pounding. "What is it?" He placed the old report on the desk between us. "Are you absolutely certain your ex-husband ever agreed to be tested?" For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The doctor's question echoed in my head. "Are you absolutely certain your ex-husband ever agreed to be tested?" I stared at him, confused. "Of course he did," I said. "We went through years of fertility treatments together." The doctor folded his hands on the desk. "I'm not asking if you both went to appointments. I'm asking if you personally saw the results of his tests." I opened my mouth to answer. Then I stopped. I remembered sitting in waiting rooms alone because Daniel had been busy at work. I remembered him saying the clinic had called, and everything on his side was completely normal. I remembered trusting him enough not to ask questions. My voice cracked. "No, I never actually saw the reports." The doctor slid an old file across the desk. "When we transferred your records into our system, the lab noticed something odd. 9 years ago, one of the specialists requested additional testing for your husband. According to these notes, he never completed the follow-up appointment." I looked at the paper, but the words were blurry through my tears. "What does that mean?" The doctor hesitated before answering. "It means you may have spent years believing you were the problem when there was never enough evidence to reach that conclusion." My entire world tilted, all those nights crying myself to sleep. All those birthdays spent wondering why my body had failed. All those moments when I apologized to Daniel for ruining his dream of becoming a father. And now I was hearing that he might never have finished the testing at all. I left the clinic in a daze. Michael was waiting in the parking lot. The second he saw my face, he rushed over. "What happened?" "Is the babies okay?" I laughed through my tears. "The babies are fine." He wrapped his arms around me. "Then why are you crying?" I looked up at him. "Because I don't know if my entire marriage was built on a lie." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every conversation I'd ever had with Daniel. Every time he'd sighed after another failed treatment. Every time he'd told me we had done everything possible. Every time he'd looked at me with disappointment I thought I deserved. By sunrise, I had made a decision. I needed the truth.